Good morning. Happy Sabbath. It's lovely to see so many people here, even if it's so cold, we were able to come and meet together and praise the Lord. This morning, we are going to be talking about some very remarkable people, but we're going to be focusing on a character that we might not know that much. At least I didn't until I started prepping for the sermon. It has been almost 59 years since the Prime Minister, Sir Winston Churchill, passed away on January 24th, 1965. He was one of the only people that was given a state funeral. The only other person that has been given a state funeral in Britain after him was Queen Elizabeth II in 2022, 2 years ago. By the decree of the Queen, his funeral was to last 4 days. The first 3 days, he was laid at the Westminster Hall, and on the fourth day, he was transported by water to the Waterloo Station, and there he was taken to St. Martin's Church, where he was to be buried with his brother and where his parents were buried. For this funeral, it took the involvement of around 1,000 policemen, 9 military bands, 18 military battalions, and 15 fighter jets. It is estimated that more than 300,000 people around England went to the streets to pay their respects when the Prime Minister died. The event was attended by 120 different dignitaries from around the world that equated to around 6,000 people, and the Queen was present for the funeral, which is not something that usually happens when a Prime Minister dies. It is also said that around 350 million people watched the funeral on TV around the world. Our current president of the United States back then, President Lyndon B. Johnson, said about Churchill when he died, "When there was darkness in the world and hope was low in the hearts of men, a generous providence gave us Winston Churchill. As long as men tell of the time of terrible danger and of the men who won the victory, the name Churchill will live. He is history's child, and what he said and what he did will never die." It was the first time in the U.S. that the flag was flown at mid-staff for a dignitary from outside of the U.S. because Churchill had died. And I don't think that is unusual. When somebody has impacted their nation's history, and in this case, the history of the world, as much as Churchill did, amidst of all the controversies that he might had, it is not uncommon that people want to do a big funeral to remember the big impact that these people had in a nation's history. And I think the Bible also does this. We see that when Jesus died, the Bible tells us that he was wrapped in linen and then placed in a grave by Joseph, which was a member of the Sanhedrin. And if we go to the Old Testament, we're also going to see that the death of many people are registered along. However, what we're going to see that even though the deaths of a lot of people are registered, the Bible doesn't give us a lot of details about the funeral, and it also doesn't tell us how people mourn most of the characters in the Bible. It does with a few. Specifically in the Old Testament, we only see 5 people that the Bible is very specific about 2 things. The first is the type of funeral that these people had. And the other thing that was very interesting to me is that only in 5 occasions in the Old Testament are we going to see that the Bible explicitly said that the people around them mourned or wept the death of these people. However, today we're not going to focus on all 5 of them. We're only going to focus on 4 of them. And the first character that we see that the Bible mentions how they died, somewhat of the funeral procession, and that the people mourned him was Moses. Now, this is not very surprising to us. Moses lived a very, very remarkable life. You know, he was born to slaves. He was thrown into the river. He was saved by the princess. He grew up in the palace. He had to flee, but he comes back 80 years later and goes and leads the people of Israel outside of Egypt. Not only does he lead them outside of Egypt, he is with them around 40 years while they're wandering through the desert. He gives the people of Israel the 10 Commandments. He establishes the temple. He establishes the high priest. He establishes how manna is supposed to be given to these people. He was a pillar of faith. He was an amazing leader. So when it's time for Moses to leave this earth, God tells Moses to please come and go to the mountain of Pisgah. And there, Moses and the people of Israel are right now in Moab. And when Moses goes on top of the mountain, God shows him all the land of Canaan. Sadly, because of some of the decisions that Moses had done until that point, he is not allowed to enter the land that God had promised to the nation of Israel. However, from the mountain, from Pisgah, he is able to see the land that he has led this people to take. And God shows him the land. He reiterates the promise that he did to the forefathers, to the three patriarchs, that the land of Canaan is going to be theirs. And then Moses rests. It is said that when Moses rests, that his strength never went away, and that his eyes never lost strength. When the people of Israel realized that Moses was gone, they mourned him for 30 days. It was a legend. Moses was a remarkable man. 30 days of mourning was fit for such a leader. The second person that we can find in the Bible that it's mentioned how he died and the rituals that were behind him was Aaron. Now, Aaron might not be such a big leader as Moses was, his younger brother was, but he wasn't far back behind. Now, unlike Moses, Aaron actually knew what it meant to be a slave. He wasn't taken away to live with a princess with the Pharaoh. He had stayed with the people of Israel and had lived with them as a slave. And when God had called Moses to say, Moses, it is time for you to go back to Egypt and go and save the people. This is the purpose I have given you. Moses was very hesitant. He said, no, I can't do it. He made a lot of excuses. And finally, the last excuse, he says, well, God, I do not remember how to speak Egyptian. I cannot do it. I can't. I'm sorry. And God says, don't worry about that, Moses. I am going to send you your brother. He is going to meet you outside, and he is going to be the person that's going to speak for you in front of Pharaoh. So Aaron and Moses are the people who go in front of Pharaoh. They are with the people of Israel when the 10 plagues happen. Aaron is there when the people of Israel leave. He has been there when the people of Israel have rebelled against Moses. To a certain point, he also made a calf of gold. But even though he didn't make the best decisions in life, God still found him fit to be the first high priest of his kingdom. He was the first high priest. All of his sons became also priests. And time again, God showed the people of Israel that he had picked Aaron to be his leader. Now, the death of Aaron was very interesting to me because if we go to Numbers 20, it is one of the first deaths that is ever announced. It says that God comes down to Moses and Aaron and he told him, "It is time for Aaron to go and be with his forefathers." So Aaron knew that he was going to die. But before Aaron is going to die, God asks Moses to do something very, very specific. He says, "I'm going to ask you to go with Aaron and his son Eliezer to Mount Or. And in front of all the congregation, I'm going to ask you to take his high priest garments and put these garments on his son. And after that, you are to go up to the mountain with his son, Moses, and Aaron. And there, Aaron dies." And when they came back down and the congregation learned that Aaron had passed away, again, they had a 30-day mourning period. Because the loss of Aaron, the loss of the high priest, was leaving a big hole in the nation of Israel. He lived a remarkable life. The first high priest, he was their leader along with Moses. So we have Moses and we have Aaron. And the third person that the Bible, the Old Testament, specifically talks about how they died is one of the patriarchs. Surprisingly, we don't see specifically how people mourned Abraham, or we don't see how specifically people mourned Isaac. It is just mentioned that they died and that their sons put them to rest. But it's not specifically said that people wept for them. But the third person that we're going to talk about today is the last patriarch. I think Jacob is one of the most controversial patriarchs because he did a lot of wrong things in his life. However, Jacob, since he was born, he was quite controversial. He was holding on to the ankle of his older brother. He deceived his dad. Then he goes and he is running away from his older brother because he had taken his inheritance. He goes and he finds his uncle. He falls in love with one of his daughters, but then is, pressured to marry both of them. Then he is cheated by his father-in-law, and then he has to run away back to Canaan, where his brother Esau is waiting to kill him. But he is able to broker peace then. And even though he had so many issues, because Rebecca, he was Rebecca's favorite son, and even though that brought a lot of issues with him, he didn't learn from that experience and actually started to show favoritism to the two sons from the wife that he actually had loved, which was Rachel, which causes his other sons to hate Joseph and sell him into slavery to go to Egypt. And when it's time for Jacob to die, he is in Egypt. Thankfully, God's providence had led Joseph to Egypt to save the Egyptians from a famine and also to save Jacob's family from a famine. But there he is in Egypt. That is not the place that God has promised the patriarchs. They were supposed to be in Canaan. However, life had taken him to Egypt. And when he knew that his time was near, Jacob put all his sons together, his 12 sons, and then he asks them to please take him back to Canaan, to the land where Abraham had bought from the Hittites, so he can be laid to rest with Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah. After he's given the blessings to all of his 12 sons, he says that he lays in his bed and then he dies. And then for Joseph, it was so emotional that the Bible said, it states in Genesis 50 that he throws himself on top of his dad, and then he asks the doctors from Egypt to please embalm his dad. And this is a process of 40 days. And after the embalmment is over, all Egypt mourns Jacob's loss for 70 days. And after that 70 days that they mourned him, Joseph goes and asks Pharaoh to please allow him to go back to Canaan to bury his father. And the Pharaoh says it's okay. But not only does he allow Joseph to go back to Canaan to bury his father, he allows all the dignitaries of Egypt to accompany him. So it's the dignitaries of Egypt, it's all of Jacob's sons and his family, and Joseph start, the caravan to take Jacob back to Canaan. But the grief is so big for them that when they reach the Jordan River, it says that the caravan stopped. And they wept again so intensely that the people around them, knew that something was happening. And if we go to Genesis 50, verse 10, it says, when the caravan, we're talking about Joseph, when they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly. And there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. So this is a 7-day mourning on top of the 70 days that they had already mourned him. When the Canaanites who lived there saw the mourning at the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning." That is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim, which means mourning of the Egyptians. So this is the third character. We have Moses, we have Aaron, which are remarkable leaders of Israel. And then we have the last patriarch, the last one that was going to allow to follow the torch, because then the 12 tribes are going to come after him. So the people mourn him. But the fourth character that we're going to talk about today is a very interesting character because, as I said, I had never, ever knew her story until I started researching for this sermon. Now, the fourth character is not a patriarch. It's not a remarkable leader. Not at all. I doubt that most of you will ever know her story. And I don't even know if I can say it's a story because really the Bible doesn't document her story. It's just one verse. And when I say her name, it's not going to be the first woman that is going to come to your mind because she is honestly not that remarkable. When we read the little verse in Genesis where her name comes up, her name is going to be completely lost to the turmoil and all the big story that is happening around her. However, the Bible takes the time to mention her death. And for that, I am going to ask you to go to Genesis chapter 35, and we're going to read the story of Deborah. No, not the Deborah of Judges, not the Deborah that stood under a tree, to being a judge, that she goes to with Israel to battle. This is not the Deborah that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about another Deborah, the other Deborah, the completely unremarkable Deborah that we find in Genesis. Now, so you can understand where we are in the story of Genesis, we're going to go back to Jacob. And Jacob right now has come back from Laban, his father-in-law. He has finally broker peace with Esau. And sadly, something happens with Dinah, one of his daughters, and his sons take revenge. And now he can't stay and seek him anymore because his sons have made a mess of the situation. So God tells Jacob right now to go back to Bethel, which is where Jacob saw the ladder where the angels were coming up and down from heaven. And this is where God tells Jacob to go. And while Jacob goes to Bethel, he also asks Jacob to please consecrate all his family once again, because in Jacob's family, people were still adoring other idols. So Jacob brings his family together, they turn in all the other gods, they consecrate themselves again, and they reach Bethel. And in verse 8, we are going to find the main character of our sermon today. It says in Genesis chapter 35, verse 8, "Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak outside Bethel. So it was named Alan Bakuth." And that's all we know about Deborah. The Bible doesn't register anything she said. It doesn't register anything, main decisions that she made. She wasn't part of a big story. This is the only time we're ever going to find Deborah. Deborah, the nurse of Rebekah. Now you might say, Abby, it's like, okay, it is odd that out of nowhere they mention that the nurse of Rebekah died, but if you consider how detailed the stories of Moses and of Aaron and of Jacob are, you can argue that this story is not as relevant as you think. But we have to consider that in the Bible, the death of not a lot of women are registered. The death of Sarah is registered, and all we know about it is that Abraham wept and that he bought a land from the Hittites to be able to bury Sarah. The death of Rebekah is not registered at all. The death of Leah and the death of Rachel, which are also the wives of patriarchs, are also registered. But in the Bible, it is not mentioned that they wept for the death of Leah and Rachel, only for the death of Sarah. So the fact that the Bible takes the time in the middle of this big story to stop and say, oh, by the way, Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, is very important to us. No other person is registered. Now, we can say it is understandable that we know the death of Rachel. It is understandable we know the death of Sarah and the death of Leah. They were the wives of the patriarch. But Deborah was just a nurse. She was just a servant. So why is the Bible registering the death of this woman? To answer this question, we're going to see why is the Bible registering the death of Deborah and what lessons can we learn from the Bible registering the death of Deborah. So who was Deborah? Now, the commentators, specifically the commentators, because we don't know a lot about Deborah, the people that go more in depth into trying to understand who Deborah was is our Jewish friends. And the rabbis have different ideas of what was happening in the story. So one of the first general ideas is that the Bible is not registering the death of Deborah, the nurse of Rebekah, but it's actually registering the death of Rebekah. But this is not a very mainstream, it's one of the ideas that's out there, but it's unlikely. The other idea out there is that maybe they're registering the death of one of the nurses that helped Rebekah when Jacob and Esau were born, but that is also unlikely. What most of the commentators and historians agree on is that they are talking about the nurse Rebekah, Deborah, the nurse of Rebekah, that left with Rebekah when Rebekah left Mesopotamia to marry Isaac. So the first time that we ever hear of Deborah is not actually in Genesis 35, verse 8, but is earlier in the book in Genesis 25, verses 59. Chapter 20, verses 59. And it says, "So they sent their sister Rebekah on her way, along with her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men." This is the first time that the Bible records of Deborah. And after that, a whole story goes on. Rebekah marries Isaac. She has 2 kids. The whole story of Jacob, half of the story of Jacob goes by. And then in the middle of the story, we hear about the nurse of Rebekah again, Deborah. Now, you might understand, okay, we know who Deborah is. But what did Deborah do that is important enough for her to be for her death to be registered in Genesis? Well, the reality is that Deborah did her job. That's all she did. Deborah was the nurse of Rebekah, and that's exactly what she did. She helped Rebekah with whatever she needed when she was going to get married. She helped Rebekah when her children were born, and she helped Rebekah to run the household. That was her job. There was nothing remarkable that Deborah ever did in the Bible. It's not like she comforted Rebekah after Jacob left. It's not like she tried to stop Rebekah from trying to deceive her husband to get Jacob to get the inheritance. Deborah did nothing that is remarkable her whole life. The only thing that Deborah did was to do her job. Simple. An unremarkable life. She did her job. She was the nurse. She was the servant. That is all she did. And then that makes me think, why is it registered then? Why, if a woman that was so completely unremarkable, did Moses take the time to register her death? Well, I think one of the beautiful lessons that we can find from Deborah is that there is virtue in the common life. Rebekah did exactly what was expected from her. But not only was what was expected from her, she did her job with faithfulness. And when we go to Patriarchs and Prophets to try to see if Ellen G. White said anything about this death that was registered, it says the following. At Bethel, Jacob was called to mourn the loss of one who had long been an honored member of his father's family, Rebekah's nurse, Deborah, who had accompanied her mistress from Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan. The presence of this aged woman had been to Jacob a precious tie that bound him to his early life, and especially to the mother whose love for him had been so strong and tender. Deborah was buried with expressions of great sorrow. That the oak under which her grave was made was called the oak of weeping. It should not be passed unnoticed that the memory of her life of faithful service and of mourning over this household friend has been accounted worthy to be preserved in the Word of God. Faithful service. Deborah didn't do anything else but her job. But her job that she did was in faithful service. And Deborah didn't know that she was special. She didn't think she was special. She didn't think she was remarkable. How did a servant girl from Mesopotamia from a long time ago know that thousands of years later, people are going to be discussing her story in a part of a land that she never even knew that existed? Deborah didn't know that. Deborah just did her function that was to be a nurse of Rebekah, and she did it faithfully, not expecting to be recorded, not expecting to be praised. She did her job faithfully. And the reality is that for most of us, we're not going to be called like Moses, and we're not going to be called like Aaron, and we're not going to be called like Jacob to do these monumental decisions or to lead a nation. But we are called to be faithful in the small tasks that are assigned to us. The life of Deborah reminds me of what Jesus said thousands of years later in the book of Matthew, when he was talking about the parable. Here in this parable, it says that there was the parable of the bag of golds, that the master came and gave each person certain amount of gold and certain amount of talents. And then he comes back And in Matthew 25:23, it says, his master replied, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness." The reality is that all of us are called to do a very small mission in God's mission here to redeem the earth. And it's not going to be big. Most of us are never going to be called to be leaders. But God still expects us to do the small tasks that he has assigned to us in a faithful way. This is what Deborah shows us. He's like, God told Deborah, I saw how faithful you were. I know how hard you work in the small tasks that I was assigned. I assigned you to be the nurse of Rebekah, to bring up her children, to bring up Esau, to bring up Jacob, to run this household, and nobody was ever going to praise you. Nobody ever, said, "Good job, Deborah. You went above and beyond from what you expected." But God says, Deborah, I saw you. In that unremarkable life, in that ordinary life, you did your job so well that at the end of your life, I made sure that your life was registered, that your whole unremarkable life was taken into account and registered in the Bible. And that is the lesson that we have this morning. God gave us a small task. It's not going to be big. And for most of us, it's going to be being faithful in an ordinary, unremarkable life. But God doesn't forget about us. He's going to say at the end of the day, in the few things you have been faithful, I will put you in charge of many things. And he is not promising us to say, we are going to write your funeral in the Bible. He is saying, I'm going to write your name in the book of life. I am coming back for you because for me, although you think your life is unremarkable, you think your task is very, very small, you are never, ever unremarkable for me. Be faithful in the small few things, and come and share in your master's happiness once I come back for you again. May God bless you.